I will introduce you. So yeah, welcome online, everybody. Yeah, from now on, will be oh yes, of course, live transcription. This will be the model that we have, an online session, and then we have basically a chance to look at your group work later on in the real space. So we'll see how we can figure that out. Anyway, we've got Dr. Tom Sykes here, who is from creative writing, and he will talk to us about storytelling, which goes beyond writing words. Is that right, Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Simone, and hello, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'll just share my screen with you and let me know if you can't see it, or if there's any problems with that. Yeah, as Simone says, I mean, I'm a writer and I teach creative writing and journalism. So my kind of reflex sort of attitude to this is storytelling through words. But I'm going to try and make this broader than that and try to make what I'm going to say to you relevant to other kinds of storytelling, visual storytelling. I mean, I'm also interested in films and comic books and things like that, but I hope some of what I'm gonna some of the sort of insights I have to share with you will be relevant to other kinds of storytelling that no doubt Simone has discussed with you in terms of how that relates to design and the more kind of straight ahead sort of visual arts and cultures and things like that. So I'll just begin with my I suppose a bit of a kind of foundational idea that I have, because I tend to teach non-fiction sort of writing, in other words, storytelling that is rooted in people's real experiences and real life. What I find useful, both to consider as a writer myself when I kind of am constructing a story, and to try and avoid getting kind of writer's block, and so that I can kind of see my way through to the end of a story. And also what I advise students to think about is to try and think about writing as being close to the way that we as human beings perceive and experience the world as possible. So I think that we should try to write and tell stories using a style and structure that reflects the way we perceive the world as human beings, with the brains that we have, but also with our other senses that are available to us. So just to sort of go through a kind of a basic sort of process for that. If you think about it, when you walk into a room, or you go somewhere, wherever it may be, spatially, geographically, maybe somewhere that's new to you, you'll notice some detail about that place. If you're in a kind of natural setting, you might notice a particular tree or a particular sort of geographical feature. If you're walking into a room, it might be an item of furniture or a particular person that you notice first. And so the first thing that comes to mind is a kind of a pretty kind of broad visceral experience of something or someone. We see and we smell and we hear something there, and we get a very kind of quite a, like I say, sort of broad, vague conception of something first of all. But then the longer we look at that thing, or the longer we focus on that thing, we notice more about it. So details accumulate about it, and then thoughts start to gather in our heads. Certain kinds of what we're experiencing at that time might trigger certain other kinds of thoughts. It might trigger certain memories, or we might start to make kind of mental associations. Oh, that tree that I'm looking at reminds me of a tree that I remember from my childhood, or whatever it might be. And then finally, we might, after that experience, after having left that situation, we'll try and make sense of what we've experienced. If it's a kind of meeting with someone, or a kind of interaction with another human being, we might think about, well, what have we gained from that? What have we learned? We, as human beings, we reflect on what we've experienced, right? And I think that this is not about. I will give you some more concrete examples if this sounds a bit abstract at the moment. But I think that, yes, the process of writing, of storytelling about the real world should follow the way that this sort of way that we perceive the world is sort of what I'd argue. It doesn't have to, but I think it's helpful if you want to think about it in those sorts of ways. I'm just going to warn against a potential risk, though, with not taking it. What I've explained to you is a kind of fairly careful procedure where you're kind of releasing information slowly, just as you experience it. As a writer, you're not wanting to rush your descriptions of things and your structuring of a story. If you do that, what happens is what I call headbanging, which is as in, it's a kind of analogy, I guess, taken from, fans of metal, fellow fans of metal will know that this is the, this is the standard way to kind of, enjoy that kind of music, and it involves moving your head around very quickly. That's why I want to use headbanging as a kind of metaphor here. And I'll give you an example of a sort of headbanging sentence in a story, and I think there will be visual equivalents of this. In other words, this is a writer who is trying to pack in too much detail and too many different events, too many different images, so it makes the reader headbang, looking all over the place, and it's confusing for the reader ultimately. So I'll just read you. This is a sort of parody. This is not, a story that's been published or anything, but it's just my attempt to kind of illustrate, the problem here. So the first sentence would be, I placed the torch in my pocket. So say this is a story, it could be a travelogue set in some kind of outdoor place, somewhere in the wilderness. So I placed the torch in my pocket. So you're kind of directing the reader to sort of imagine, to, as it were, their mind's eye to be looking towards the pocket of this character, that's narrating this story. And then we've got a bird squawked from the forest behind me. So suddenly we're being taken somewhere else to another detail. We've introduced another, if you like, a character, another sound, another event. We've also got a sense of where we are, which is the forest. So there's a forest behind us and there's a bird squawking behind. Okay, so we're looking over there now. And then the next sentence is where I think it starts to get a bit rushed and kind of cluttered in the sense of details and information. So the mountain was colder now, and Fred had been gone at the lake for 6 hours. So suddenly we've got the mountain and a lake have sort of formed part of this setting in this story. We're talking about coldness. We're feeling cold. That's another sense of that's being introduced. Fred is another character. And he's been gone at this somewhere at the lake, wherever the lake is. And then suddenly Amy screamed. So we're introducing Amy. There's a lot going on here. What I'm saying is there's too much going on here. A more accomplished writer or storyteller might spend a bit more time describing, the bird squawking from the forest behind me, a bit more detail. What did the squawk sound like? Maybe a little bit more detail about where the forest is in relation to the character. Why is the character in the forest? So it's all a bit confusing, all a bit messy, all a bit headbanging. And it's, at the end of the day, the reader or whoever is consuming your story or following your story can't follow it very easily. So we have to be aware of that. And as I say, I'm talking about a kind of the written word here, but I'm sure you guys as artists and designers and working in other media can think of sort of equivalents where you're just possibly bombarding the viewer or the person looking at your work, the consumer, if you like, with maybe too many images, too much detail, so it gets confusing. So it's about sort of taking things slowly. So that's sort of potential problem number one. Just to also talk a little bit about, obviously we don't only perceive the world in terms of what's happening in real time, in terms of what is there in front of us at that moment at the time of time. So the human mind isn't merely a camera that records what is happening out there in the physical world. It's more than that. It's much more sophisticated than that. We have certain thoughts and feelings too that relate to what we're experiencing. And I mentioned memories, but we also have other kind of faculties available to us, which should form part of our stories. I think and I think some of the best narratives, some of the best stories will kind of move between fantasy and memory and projecting forward and what's being experienced at that time. at the present time. And I just want to sort of quote a little bit from Mary Karr, who's wrote an excellent book called The Art of Memoir. And she talks about sort of what she calls, I think, non-traditional sort of experiences or ways of looking at the world, which are, you know, which are nonetheless worth kind of including in any writing that you do about, you know, your own life, about your past, about things that you used to do, connections that you made with people, experiences that you've had, places you've traveled to, and so forth. So she says, first of all, moving back and forth through time when appropriate and giving info you didn't have at the time, which breaks point of view. So even though in the real, you know, this is where the analogy with the way we experience the world starts to sort of break down a little bit, because in the real world, the laws of physics do not allow us to travel back and forth through time to different periods of our lives, but our minds can do that. You know, we can imagine, we can remember. And if you think about it, you know, in film, they call it a flashback. You know, we learn something new about the character at that moment in the story because suddenly some information about their past is revealed to us, which we didn't know up to that moment. And we can be doing that obviously in different, you know, different media as well. Moving back and forth. Sometimes there can be sort of humor and irony can come from this, you know, that there's that sort of we've all had moments, I think, in our lives where we've thought, like, if only I'd known then what I know now, with the benefit of hindsight, I wouldn't have made that terrible mistake. You know, I wouldn't have, you know, gone into that relationship or, you know, bought that dodgy car or whatever it might be, right? So, you know, we can do that in storytelling as well. We can kind of use the past to sort of, you know, flashing back the past to try and kind of make sense of the present of the story, you know, and to try and contextualize things. She also talks about something else that's kind of a non-realistic way of writing about, you know, or of telling a story, or strictly non-realistic, is where we recreate dialogue. You know, if we're telling a story about the past based on real life, it's unlikely that we're going to remember word for word what was said in certain conversations with people. I mean, that's even truer if you're trying to tell a story about other people. There's a certain genre called creative nonfiction where people will writers will take moments from history and try to sort of dramatize them. You know, I mean, any of you who have watched kind of like I don't know, stuff like you know, what's that thing about the royal family? You know, you know, that long-running thing on Netflix. I can't remember the name of it, but they've recreated these sort of moments from the history of the royal family, right? But they weren't there. They weren't there sitting next to Princess Diana when she said this, or Prince Philip when he said that. So what they've done is they've recreated that dialogue. They've tried to imagine what they might have said, right? So that again is another sort of technique. You know, you'll recreate that based on as much research as you can do, or as much as you. If it's a story about yourself and your own experiences, you'll be, you know, basing that on what you can remember, right? Something else that Mary Karr talks about is stopping to describe something in the midst of a heated scene. So this is in film. This is like what you might call slow motion. You know, when there's what might in real life take a moment, you know, a nanosecond, can be sort of stretched out within the context of a story because it's significant, it's dramatic. You know, very often you'll see these in sort of fight scenes. Like in real life, a fight might last 2 seconds or 2 minutes, but, you know, think of action films and the way that they will use slow motion to kind of emphasize or dramatize this particular scene of violence or scene of action. You can do the same with the written word, and I think you can do the same with images. I mean, there are many great comic books. I don't know if anyone has read From Hell, the Alan Moore comic book, which is about the Jack the Ripper, so, you know, in part about the sort of Jack the Ripper sort of story. And there are these long pages and pages of quite graphic kind of, you know, violence in order to sort of, you know, I'm assuming that the artist and the writer did that in order to try and, you know, emphasize the kind of just the nastiness of this sort of, aspect of the story. The final thing that Mary Karr talks about is recounting old fantasies. So there are things that we see and experience in the real world, but there are also things that we imagine, and that we have, there's the unconscious mind that is always, there's a huge part of the human experience. So we go to bed at night and we dream things that are often completely absurd and completely illogical, or we daydream, or we might start imagining things under the influence of certain substances, drink and drugs and so forth. The brain has that capacity, and there's no reason why those sorts of fantasies, those sorts of impressions that the brain gets or the mind gets that are not directly caused by our day-to-day experience, there's no reason why that can't form part of our stories as well. And I imagine as artists, a lot of your kind of, I don't know about you, but I've often been inspired by my own dreams, even if it's just a particularly powerful image. And many great artists, throughout history have been very much inspired by their unconscious. So the other thing is that we might also want to bring background research into our stories, even stories about our own experiences, because there will be only so much that we can know from what we've experienced. In my own sort of experience as a journalist, traveling a lot and going to certain countries where there are big political situations going on. I've reported on things like presidential elections in West Africa. Now, there's only, I could learn a certain amount from my own personal work in terms of interviewing people, in terms of where I could travel to and what I could experience with my own senses. But there's obviously a far bigger picture there that I could only really learn about by reading books and reading other people's sort of articles and analyses and things like that. So, that, and again, I think that will be the same with the sort of stories that you want to tell. Just to say a little bit more, so in just following on from that, very often what we're doing with stories is that we're sort of transitioning between the subjective and the objective. We're transitioning between things that we've personally experienced and things that we can only have known about through, as it were, secondhand, things that we've researched through books and maybe watching films and through other media, through what people have told us. There are all sorts of other, sort of channels that we can use for that. And I think it's one of the keys to telling a good story is how you sort of tie those things together quite seamlessly, or sew those things together quite seamlessly, the objective and the subjective. And just to quote Kari Gísláson, who's a sort of scholar of travel writing, she talks about how writers should tie exposition to a specific point in the journey. So what she's saying there is that if you're writing a story about a particular trip that you've done or a particular place that you've traveled to, you'll want to you'll have your story of where you personally traveled to each of those places, right? Which can be the framework for your story. That can be the sort of plot that you're going to use. But then, so for example, when the first point of that, the first stage of that story might be traveling to a particular city, right? Any city, it doesn't matter. There will be a certain amount that you can experience. You might see a nice cathedral, you might go to a shop, you might go to a restaurant, and that's all well and good. And you can narrate that, you can include that as part of your story. But there will then be a certain amount of information that you may then decide to kind of, pick up some pamphlet inside the cathedral that gives you some historical background to that cathedral, when it was built and, what it's made out of and what kind of architectural style it is, etc., etc. So what she argues is that, you use your, so that you don't, in a kind of clunky and jarring way, sort of jump between the subjective and the objective. What you do is you have to write about, so I went to this cathedral, I did this, I did that, and then that gives you a sort of platform that gives you a kind of springboard to bring in the kind of external information. And very often she argues that a kind of a travel narrative is a sort of series of these kind of points in a journey that were taken by the author or the writer or the filmmaker. embellished with this kind of external information. And that's really because, and she says, events in a non-fiction story don't occur in isolation of their social context. Of course, you going alone will have your kind of very narrow sort of subjective view of that place. But at the same time, you know, as storytellers, we have to be aware that there is a kind of world and there's a history and there's a whole context that's bigger than us that we need to bring in, I think, very often to kind of make the story work and to make it interesting. So I've got an idea. I've developed this, what you might call a kind of formula based on just a lot of reading that I've done. And again, this is, you know, applies to the written word, but I think there could be equivalents in visual storytelling. I'm sure there are. If I you know, knew more, had more of an education in visual cultures, then I could be sure of that. But perhaps that's something that, you know, we can talk about in the Q&A in terms of you know, whether you guys can think of sort of analogues for this in particular. And what I found is that very often there's a lot of kind of non-fiction writing that will begin, but I'm talking at the very deep level of kind of sentences and paragraphs, you know, at that very kind of close micro level. So very often a paragraph will begin with a striking visual or dramatic detail that was witnessed personally by the traveller or the narrator of the story, which then impels him or her or they or however they may wish to identify to reflect on what that detail means more widely. What are the wider implications of that detail? What does it mean culturally, historically, politically, that kind of thing? And the key is how slickly you transition between that kind of initial visual, visceral, lived experience, you know, that thing encountered and seen, and how you move from that to this much bigger idea without, as I say, sort of it seeming jarring or somehow disjointed. And there are some of the great writers are able to do that. And I'll give you an example here of from Salman Rushdie, his book, The Jaguar Smile from 1987, which is a travelogue of when he traveled to Nicaragua, which had recently had a kind of socialist revolution. This was a country that was building a new society. One of their kind of stated aims was to make art and culture much more prominent in the society. So Salman Rushdie, as a sort of British Indian author, was interested to go there and see what was happening in that society. So I'll just read you this quote here. So meanwhile, across town, 7 women poets were reciting in the ruins of the Grand Hotel. Most of the hotel had collapsed in the earthquake. What remained, a central courtyard overlooked by balconies and open now to the sky, served the city as a cultural centre. So immediately you've got this bizarre, almost surreal image of people reading poetry in a sort of semi-ruined hotel, you know. And you know, as you guys will know, as artists and as visual cultures people, you know, you don't just draw or depict any old boring thing. You're looking for those kind of remarkable and unusual and surreal and bizarre images and that come to you, whether through real life or online or through memes or however they come to you. So that's the way Rushdie starts, you know, with that kind of very visceral image of like, this is not something that happens every day, right? Watching people read their poems in the ruins of the Grand Hotel. The ruins were crowded with poetry lovers. So this is where it branches out. This is where Rushdie has sort of experienced something, written about it, and then it's triggered him to think about, you know, to think more deeply about what's going on and how to put this into a kind of wider context. I did not think I'd ever seen a people, even in India and Pakistan, where poets were revered, who valued poetry as much as the Nicaraguans. Right? So it's a kind of 3-part structure, not to kind of simplify this or reduce it to a kind of boring formula. But I think what's going on here is that, as I say, Rushdie describes what he's witnessed, this arresting, bizarre image. Then he associates it. This causes a sort of personal memory. He is from the Indian subcontinent. Grew up in Bombay. A family were originally Kashmiri, I think. You know, this makes him think about his own background. And he knows that, you know, he makes the point that actually where he comes from, poets are kind of adored and respected by the public, generally speaking. And then finally, it leads on to this wider kind of almost political point that art and literature are highly respected in this new society that's being built in Nicaragua, right? So there's that sort of movement from that kind of initial impression of something to a kind of wider thought. And I think that is, key to constructing a story of this kind, right? I'll give you a much quicker version. This is from Colin Thubron, the British travel writer who went to Russia and wrote a book called Among the Russians, not as you would expect. This is just 2 sentences really, but there's a similar sort of thing going here. Now, this is where he gets invited to get drunk with, I think, an engineer that he meets on his travels, because this is the sort of time of the Soviet Union, quite a closed society at that time. Russia was. It was quite unusual for a British guy to be driving around, which is what he did for several months. And he met this engineer in Novgorod, one of the cities there, who invited him to have a drink. So we started to drink. Right, that's the sort of the memory, the anecdote, if you like. We started to drink, and then that leads immediately to this kind of broader. I think by this point, Thubron had been invited to drink vodka with quite a few Russians. Right, he'd realised that there was something quite a lot of importance placed in drinking, not unlike our culture, by the way, and lots of other cultures. I suppose it's maybe a European thing. I don't know, but. So he goes on to say, vodka, the colourless innocence, it's the curse and liberation of Russia, a self-obliterating escape from tedium and emptiness, from interminable winter nights and the still longer, darker nights of the soul. So just that experience of sitting down, drinking with this guy, probably with the help of, the vodka as alcohol often does, it starts to make our mind, make us think laterally and sort of, think more broadly about things. It then leads in terms of the way that he's structured this piece of writing, this story, this mini story, which forms, obviously, is a small part of a much longer book. It allows him to kind of open out the writing into a general sort of comment about, the meaning of vodka, the cultural and social meaning of vodka in Soviet life, right? So it's about... I'll just say something like, having gone into that, say quite sort of microscopic detail about how one kind of structures a story based on real life, or not necessarily. You have to do a bit more thinking about structure, I think. As you know, any story, well, I'm sure you all know, real life does not always work out in in a sort of organized, patterned way. And when we sort of base stories on real life, it's not a question of recording absolutely everything that happened or reporting on absolutely everything that happened. That would be really, really dull. You can't and don't want every detail, because there's, if you think about it, if you think of any kind of, film or any kind of narrative, any story that you like or care about, it's the important moments that constitute the story. We don't see Batman getting up in the morning, brushing his teeth, having a shave, but we can assume that he does that, but we don't need to see it. It doesn't need to be part of the story. We only need to see Batman doing his kind of, stuff that he does in order to, fighting crime, etc., because that's what's relevant to the story. Maybe a different kind of story about Batman would focus on him brushing his teeth. And, if you were trying to, say something about the kind of, the private life of Batman. But generally speaking, those sorts of stories, those details are not relevant. And, we have to make that choice as storytellers all the time about what are the most compelling moments, what are the most compelling images that we need to tell a story, what are the most compelling words, or if you're a filmmaker, what needs to be portrayed dramatically, and then you build your story out of those. And I think, what we just saw there was what you might call scenes, the Rushdie and the Thubron examples. These kind of key moments in a story. And again, how do we construct these scenes? How do we decide what makes a good scene over a bad scene? You know, and especially when we're basing this on real life experience, what were the most interesting and distinctive moments of this experience, I think is a good place to start, you know, in terms of trying to come up with what makes for a good scene. You know, this might be a question, it should be a question of emotion. You know, what drama, humor, fear, loathing, jealousy, etc. arose? Were there moments of risk? Were there moments of conflict? They say that every story, and rightly, every story needs a conflict. I don't mean a physical, violent conflict. I mean some sort of challenge, some sort of, you know, problem to be solved. It might be a kind of a very subtle sort of emotional conflict between two people. It might be a love triangle. It might be people competing for love, competing for some, you know, some reward, you know, a quest type narrative. There are problems to be solved. There are moments of understanding or enlightenment. I think especially towards the end of your story, you want to be thinking about scenes or moments that have taught you some kind of lesson, or have taught the characters some sort of lesson that seem to offer some kind of insight. The way that we convey that is that we is also a kind of you know, a question of technique. This is, I'm going to be talking again about writing here, but I'm sure that this, you know, has an equivalent in other art forms. So I'm going to quote Steven Pinker here, who's a kind of linguistic philosopher, linguistic thinker, who wrote an excellent book called The Sense of Style, which I would really recommend. And he talks about this particular kind of style called classic prose. And he says, in classic prose, the writer is directing the gaze of the reader to something in the world she can see herself. So the idea is that as creatives, as writers, as artists, we've got a kind of idea in our heads, or we've experienced something, and we've got an idea of the sort of story we want to tell. And the challenge is to be able to kind of almost telepathically implant that in the minds of our readers, our viewers, etc. And the way that we implant that is through language, or through, and how well we write, or it's how well we create images, or how well we you know, produce our films, or whatever medium we're working in. And Pinker says, classic prose shows the events making up the subject matter by narrating an unfolding plot with real characters doing things, rather than by naming an abstract concept that encapsulates those events in a single word. So it's all about detail. It's all about specifics and details, and it's about avoiding generalization and abstraction. If Rushdie had just sort of, in very vague terms, said, well, I turned up and in this place and it was a bit, you know, didn't name the fact that it was a hotel, just said this place was a bit of a wreck, a bit horrible. Some people were reading some stuff out. If it was communicated in those very vague, sort of lazy terms, that scene would not have the power. It's the fact that he goes into the details. He describes the textures and the shapes, and he gives names to things. You know, that's what creates a kind of clear image in our heads, like an almost HD image, if we want to use that kind of analogy with a HD TV, you know, where you can see a much wider spectrum of colors and you can see all the details. You know, you can see the blades of grass when you're watching a football match or whatever, you know, as opposed to, you know, a kind of fuzzy picture, you know, on a kind of old-fashioned TV that most of you are too young to remember that, where you had to tune in a crappy old TV, and it was, you know, most of the time it looked like there was a kind of snowstorm going on if you couldn't get the old UHF tuning right. Now everything's digital, of course, so we have HD, and, you know, these things tend to work better. So yes, it is about clarity and concreteness and detail, I think, and that's the key to storytelling. So a story is a crafted, structured narrative based on events. We've talked about scenes, we've talked about those small moments. Those are the building blocks of a story. But we also have to do some work in terms of how we connect those moments, those scenes together, so that they form what Aristotle called a unified, coherent whole, right? And the way we do that, there are certain kind of threads that need to run through that broader, longer sort of story to make it make sense. And there's what's called symmetry, you know, where we have certain ideas, images, characters that are introduced and continued and sustained and sort of complement each other and reflect each other. And you'll know this because of, you know, again, any stories that maybe you've created or stories that you're a fan of. Films will often start with a certain image and end with a certain image in order to kind of have that coherence, that symmetry. I'll give you another example from the Rushdie book. So in the prologue to that book, there's this, what seems like quite a kind of small, unimportant image, which is hat or sort of headgear, you know. And you think, well, that's just a small thing. That's not important to a story. Here's a story about, you know, traveling to a kind of revolutionary society. What, you know, like surely there are bigger themes, bigger things that we need to worry about than hats. But actually, psychologically, when we read, when we or follow any kind of story, you know, we are kept engaged and interested by those small details. You know, this has been proven. So at the beginning of the prologue of his book, there's a line here. The 17th is the real hat in air moment, the Dia de Alegría, the day of joy. So he's talking about the Independence Day for that country, for Nicaragua. And so what metaphor does he choose? Okay, a hat in the sense of people throw their hats up in the air to celebrate an important event, right? You know, people do it. Graduates do it. I think that picture there is from when graduates throw their hats up in the air. And you think, okay, so he's introduced that kind of image of the hat. Now he doesn't just, you never mention it again. In about the middle of the prologue, he mentions Sandino, who was the original sort of revolutionary leader, Augusto Sandino, I think his name was. And he mentions his hat in some picture of him. You know, you think, okay, you know, another hat. But at the end, he talks about graffiti that he's seen around the place. He said, in many instances, FSLN, which is the revolutionary movement, graffiti were followed by a schematic drawing of the celebrated headgear. So here is, as I say, this kind of thread, this kind of repeated image. And if anyone's seen the film Miller's Crossing, the Coen brothers, they do, throughout that film, they do really interesting things with hat. I mean, it's set in the 1930s anyway, when people just wore hats more. Almost nobody really wears hat. Every person, I think, pretty much wore a hat. And you had such a choice of different hats. You had sort of Homburgs and, you know, top hats and boaters. That film is very similar in the sense that there's a lot of imagery, like people will, it's a gangster film, but you'll see a lot of close-ups of people doffing their caps or throwing their hats on the floor. It's, as I say, it's one of those kind of images, one of those threads that allows us to keep following a story and to, you know, for a story to be coherent. On that similar point is the concept of Chekhovs gun. This is Anton Chekhov, the famous playwright. He said, one must not put a loaded rifle on the stage if no one is thinking of firing it. So if you introduce one of these threads, it doesn't have to be a minor image like a hat or a, you know, or a particular, you know, hairstyle or, you know, flower or something. It can be quite a major element. It can be a loaded rifle on the stage. But the idea is that if you introduce an element, you have to make sure you develop it. You have to make sure you keep calling back to it. Or if you're not going to develop it, you're not going to return to it, don't introduce it in the first place. You know, that's very important. Just to talk a little bit about plotting and structure. We have what's called the story arc, which is, I think this example here is from film. Now it's an arc. The reason why it's an arc and not a kind of wobbly line or a triangle or any other shape is that the idea is that the story is supposed to get more and more interesting and more gripping as you go along. So it's an upward move, right, rather than any other direction. If it starts really interesting and gets more and more boring, then you're not doing it right. You know, this is not a very good story. Now, the challenge, I think, when you're working up narratives and stories from real life is that obviously real life doesn't always happen like this. You do not necessarily, you know, the most interesting thing that will happen to you today does not necessarily happen at like 5 minutes to midnight. It might do on some days, but generally not. Sometimes I think the most exciting thing that happens to me all day is like when I eat breakfast, and it's just sort of downhill from there, unfortunately. But the way around that is and this is something that we mentioned Colin Thubron earlier on, he said one of those techniques that a storyteller can use is to, if, for example, over a particular period of a trip or an experience, the most interesting thing happened to you, what we might call the climax of your story happened on day 2 out of day 20. You as a storyteller can play around with that sort of causality, if you like, and move your climax to day 19, right? In a fictional story, when you're just making it up from scratch, it's a lot easier because you just make up something that happened. You know, the final battle, you know, the big battle in a kind of action film is going to be in the last third of the story, not in the first third, right? The moment when finally the lovers get together, or, you know, the quest is achieved, is going to happen at the end of the story, not 30 minutes in, right? So, but if you're developing, you know, there's more of a challenge in that sense if you're you know, trying to develop a narrative out of real life experiences, because real life does not play out like a story, unfortunately, you might say. Just a couple of other, I'll just go through very quickly these, but I'm happy to sort of share the slides. I think Simone's made a recording anyway of other kind of useful sort of templates that have been used by storytellers in every medium, especially this one. This is called The Hero's Quest, and it's by Joseph Campbell, who was a very respected sort of American expert in mythology. And he was someone who analyzed stories from all over the world, going back to the time of antiquity, from almost every culture. And what he found was that there is this pretty standard kind of story structure called the hero's quest, the hero's journey, right? And there's a very good, if any Star Wars fans here may be interested to go on YouTube and look at him having some really interesting discussions with George Lucas, you know, the creator of Star Wars, because Lucas was very influenced by Joseph Campbell. A lot of musicians were, Jim Morrison from the Doors was very much influenced. So this, you know, people wrote songs with this in mind. People have done comic books with this in mind. People have, you know, visual artists, sculptors have used some of these ideas. And it really and you'll recognize this because of because of the sort of stories that you may have read or watched or experienced. So it starts off with a decision to act. It starts off with an ordinary world, a moment of normality. The hero is not necessarily anyone famous. They may in fact be very humble. I mean, the Jesus story, a lot of religious stories fit into this mold as well. Then there's a call to adventure. There's a moment when there's a challenge to the kind of ordinariness or the sort of, you know, neatness of the world. And our hero is presented with some goal that has to be achieved. There's always an initial rejection or a refusal, you know, and you know this from the sort of tackiest Hollywood films, you know, where the kind of, you know, the hero has this kind of moment of like, no, I'm not a hero. I can't do that. I can't fight. And then then what happens is they get a mentor. They get another character. This might be Obi-Wan Kenobi in the Star Wars story, if those of you who are fans. Any number of other kind of examples you can find in literature and art and, you know, narrative art. And they're given the advice, the encouragement, the equipment, the money, whatever they need to go on the quest. So they go on the quest, and then that's the first stage out the way. It's a 3-act story. So the second act is the quest itself. They approach to what's called the inmost cave. It's a special world. It's a sort of different world that only the hero is equipped to deal with. Now, that when we say special world, it doesn't mean an invented sort of fantasy world. It can be a different world. It can be, you know, think of crime fiction, crime movies. It's very often someone moving into a kind of dangerous world of crime that maybe beforehand they knew nothing about or weren't involved with at all. Then they come up against what they call the supreme ordeal. This is, you know, a big battle, a big baddie, a big boss, whatever it might be. And there's a kind of reward available. something is won, something achieved, price, secret weapon, knowledge. And then 3 is the kind of consequences of what happened, the final act, the kind of road back. There might be a resurrection, literally in the case of like the Jesus story. And there's a return to normality. There's, you know, the character, the hero may bring back something of worth. You know, something has changed, something has been achieved by it. I'll just very quickly race through another formula that's more recent, the Dent Formula, which was coined in 1936 by Lester Dent, who was a kind of unashamed writer of kind of pulp fiction in the 1930s. And this is very much for, and it's written in the 30s, and you can see some of the language is very much, you know, very hard-boiled and from that time. And he said this is a formula, a master plot for any 6,000 word pulp story. This is a guy who made a good living by writing stuff like this, Doc Savage. A lot of stories that would end up being, you know, really where we get, I mentioned Batman earlier, and a lot of what we, you know, comic books and the Marvel and DC universes are very much influenced by this kind of pulp literature. It says, first act, it's literally first line or as near there to as possible. Introduce the hero, swat him with a fistful of trouble. Hinted a mystery, a menace, or a problem to be solved, something the hero has to cope with. The hero pitches in to cope with his fistful of trouble. He tries to fathom the mystery, defeat the menace, or solve the problem. Introduce all the other characters as soon as possible. Bring them on in action. So it's almost like a little box tick. You know, you could like filling out an application. You know, once you've filled out that bit, jobs are good, and that's the first act out of the way. Second act, hero's endeavors land him in an actual physical conflict near the end of the first act. So that's the sort of first major bit of action. In his world, it would be a sort of punch up or a gunfight or a, you know, people coming at each other with something awful like switchblades or whatever. Near the end of the first act, there is a complete surprise twist in the plot development. So far, does it have suspense? Is there a menace to the hero? Does everything happen logically? Again, that's very crucial. Whatever story that we're telling, we have, everything has to be, you know, has to happen logically. Second act, shovel more grief onto the hero. Hero being heroic struggles, and his struggles lead up to another physical conflict, a surprising plot twist to end the 1,500 words. Again, you ask those same questions, and this is quite true of any storytelling. Don't tell about it. Show how the thing looked. This is one of the secrets of writing. Never tell the reader, show him or her. He trembles, roving eyes, slackened jaw and such. Make the reader see him or her or anyone else. Again, it's that importance of detail and specificity. Third act, it's starting to get a bit repetitive now, but if you do it well enough and these conflicts are kind of different enough in terms of, you know, who they're up against and what kind of weird and wonderful characters they're coming up against, it will be interesting. And you keep asking, you know, he'd keep asking himself these questions, and then that would be that. I'll stop there. There's one more thing that I'm called, which is a sort of essay that I might forward to Simone, called Cinema of the Mind, which likens writing stories in prose to writing stories or telling stories cinematically. But I think it's probably better if I sort of provide that with you later, in which case I will stop there and thank you for listening. We have a bit of time for questions if anyone